Hi, I'm Nathaniel and this is my movie reviews that I did for my final project for AP Environmental Science this year. The first documentary that I chose was called Cowspiracy. The length of this documentary is an hour and a half. This documentary was directed by Kip Anderson. So this documentary, it was published in 2014. What this documentary follows is it follows kind of this journey of this guy who really wants to make a positive impact on the environment, and he does things in his everyday life to be more environmentally conscious, like taking short showers and biking everywhere, and just overall steps in order to reduce his carbon footprint every day. And he does a little bit of research. Through what he discovered, there are hundreds of millions of gallons of water that are being wasted due to our current agriculture practices. More specifically, our practices when carrying livestock and our practices when, raising cattle and chickens and farms and animals that we raise just for the sake of eating. So he talks about how many gallons of water are constantly used for agriculture. He talks about how he discovered through this post by the United Nations that US agriculture practices use more water on average, double, almost triple than what our oil and gas industries use in order to extract non-renewable resources from deep in the ground. So essentially what he discovered from this one post was that our current agriculture practices are a lot more harmful to the environment than tapping into energy resources, which is absolutely astonishing considering that no one really ever thinks about our agriculture practices. I mean, we definitely do, but we don't target that as the main culprit towards what is driving up our CO2 emissions so high and damaging our ozone layers. So he talks with different organizations, being in California, he has access to talk to a lot of different environmental organizations which have a lot of headquarters that surround him in the San Francisco and Southern California area. So he is able to go to a lot of different representatives with all of these large organizations, and they all give him very similar information that basically either dodges the question altogether or doesn't really give a clear answer on why agriculture and livestock carrying could be a large factor. And then he discusses basically how there have been other people in countries such as Brazil and other countries which cattle bearing and ranching are really, really big parts of their economy, and basically how they've been kind of advocating against it since it is so bad for the environment. Unfortunately, it's like they've been mysteriously killed or murdered just because they've been trying to support this cause, and it being such a big industry, of course, people don't want, it to be let out that this is such a bad thing. And there has been a lot of suppression with American journals, with the FBI on how they've used their resources in order to prevent information from coming out on how bad cattle ranching and livestock carrying is bad for the environment, basically just because it would require a really, really large shift for a lot of Americans in their daily way of lives in order to make our practices more sustainable. So it's a lot easier just to hide the information. So how this documentary relates to what we've learned in AP Environmental Science. So basically this does talk a lot about how different agriculture practices and irrigation methods and different ways that we bring food from farm to table, how those all have different both benefits and cons on how we can do that as efficiently as possible, how it can be the most efficiently monetarily, or how it can be most environmentally sustainable. And it basically kind of explores the idea of how we can best find the balance between an economically sustainable way of bringing food from farm to table, as well as still be able to have an industry that is good for our economy and brings jobs. So my second documentary that I chose was An Inconvenient Truth. The length of this documentary is an hour and a half as well. This documentary was filmed in 2006 by Davis Guggenheim. This documentary follows a previous United States Vice President and a former candidate for the White House, Al Gore, who has been a very, very large activist for environmental issues and protecting our ozone and standing up against large non-renewable resource corporations. And he's done a lot in order to be able to track our CO2 emissions and in order to show that climate change is a real thing that we face and that there is a correlation between the fossil fuels that we use with the level of CO2 that is within our atmosphere. Through this presentation that he gives, he talks a lot about how the steps that he has gone through within his career and the places that he's visited and the information that he's collected and how he has brought a lot more information to the surface and made a lot more resources more readily available to everyday citizens in order for basically the public and the American people and everyone in the world, in order to allow more people to realize how big of an impact the fossil fuels and the decisions that we make within our lives can affect the environment. And him being a politician, he really does a great job at making sure that this isn't just a political issue, more so that he just doesn't have an overall agenda to push, that this is more a moral issue. And this is something that we should care about because it really, really affects everyone's lives and not just certain people's, that this is a human issue altogether. And it's not just about being an American, it's not just an American issue, it's not just a certain demographics issue, but it is an issue that affects everyone in the world. So how this ties into what we've learned throughout the year is one of his main points is how CO2 emissions affects large amounts of ice and the polar ice caps in large glaciers, and how with the warming of the environment and those melting and turning into water, how that can affect sea level rises, which can then affect weather and cause more large events such as Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Irene and any large and very devastating phenomenon that we've had, and how warming and melting of these ice caps will just end up causing more of that. He talks a lot about how more than just what we can do as individuals, such as driving a more fuel efficient car or driving less or running the shower less, or he talks about those things on how us as individuals can help diminish these effects, but he also talks a lot about how we need to instate more stricter regulations as far as burning oil and coal, and how these activities that we do at large don't really hurt the environment, and that how that causes a much greater effect on our carbon footprint than what any one of us contribute individually. Talks a lot about how there is a common disbelief that in order to do what is right for the planet that we must sacrifice our economic growth and our economic gain, and that we will have to make sacrifices for our own economy in order to help the planet, when in fact it's the exact opposite, that if we do what is right to help bring in more renewable resources and burn less coal and fuel and use less fuel, that it actually in the long run will help create more jobs and create more industries that are more sustainable in order to ensure that we have a planet that is here for the future and that is here for future generations of citizens and future generations of Americans as well. So the last film that I chose is called Seaspiracy. Just like the last two, the length of this movie is also an hour and a half long. I'm pretty sure that this is done with at least with the same company as Cowspiracy, so you can kind of see the similarity between the names there. The main focus of this one is how human impact has an effect on ocean populations. It talks a lot about how our fishing practices affect the population of mammals such as whales and dolphins, and how by hunting those species, it then affects the other species that are lower within the food chain, and how our impact causes a great disruption into the food chain. How this documentary starts out, it starts out with a guy very similar to Cowspiracy, on how that one starts out with a guy who just wants to, better himself environmentally and better his own environmental practices. It starts with a guy who originally starts with the idea that the plastics that we pollute the earth with that end up as trash and litter within the ocean, how that is what we should worry about what we should mainly worry about when it comes towards population issues within the ocean. But then he also does more research and discovers the main root of the issue stems from overfishing and how there's a much larger demand nowadays for seafood products such as shark fin soup, tuna, salmon, and other things that a lot of people have a high demand for. So his initial discovery is he visits a small island in Japan, and he notices how they're specifically hunting larger mammals such as whales and dolphins. And he discovers that they're really doing this in order to ensure that there's a higher population of smaller fish that are more marketable. Dolphin and whales eat, such as salmon and tuna and species that are found over there. And they're doing this in order to try and have more harvestable fish that they can bring to the market and sell in order to bring more of a profit, despite the negative effects this has on the food chain. So basically how this ties into what we've learned is just overfishing and the effects which the human demand has on the populations of sea life and how that can then affect the rise in CO2 emissions. Basically, there is no real sustainable way in order to harvest fish and bring to the market. It's always going to be something that holds a great burden on our environment. Thank you so much for listening to what I have to say about these films. I really enjoy watching them myself, and I would recommend them to anyone out there who wants to learn more about sustainability and who wants to learn more about just how the everyday decisions within our lives affects our environment and affects the world we live in. And it definitely is a great way to wrap up everything that we've learned within this year in AP Environmental Science. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great afternoon.